Perfect, perfect. So I guess our first like sort of topic that we want to sort of delve into a little bit is your political career in terms of how did it begin, sort of what got you into politics as like sort of a passion.
Oh, well, I mean, that's a because I'm old, that's a very long story. So we're going to have to be quick précis. But I suppose I was always interested in what was happening in the world from your age. And I, I, I was interested in current affairs, and my family talked about politics all the time in a very informal way. I don't mean it was kind of watching documentaries, watching current affairs programs. We always watched the news. We talked about it. We argued about it a lot. So I was interested in politics, but I don't think I had a very clear set of political principles. And it was only when I went to university, really, that I started to understand that there was, I mean, left and right. I had a vague sense of that. I mean, I don't mean to be naive about it. My father had a period of voting for the Conservatives, one of those working class Tories. My mother was completely antagonistic to that. She was always Labour. I kind of saw myself as a bit of a rebel in general at school, but I didn't really have a clue, basically. And when I went to university, and at that stage, there was, you know, almost hundreds, but certainly lots and lots and lots of far left groups at university who were outside revolutionaries of one sort or another. There was also some quite open people who openly admitted to being far right. And then, so the Labour Party and the Conservative Party and the Lib Dems seemed all a bit tame in the middle as I kind of looked around. So I started to read and just take an interest in student politics. That's what got me into it in some ways. I was also then a practicing Catholic, and there was a brand of Catholicism that was called liberation theology, and I read a lot about that. So I was I liked this notion of radical Catholic doctrine, and so I read a little bit about that. So that's the kind of start of it all. Um, but then it's boring because it goes on and on and on for a long, long time. I got involved in revolutionary politics, as did many of my peers at the time. That was not unusual because that was, as I said, there was like so many different revolutionary left groups that I read around and chose, kind of joined one and then left it and joined another. And I was particularly interested in anti-racism and anti-imperialism at the time because I'm from an Irish background. Our family had, you can imagine when they came over, we're treated as second-class citizens in many ways. So it gave me an extra kind of insight into why people's being treated as unequal. And then as a woman, obviously, that particularly at that period in the late 70s, 80s, even though of course most of the women's liberation movement's aims had been achieved, it was at the back end of that kind of feminist revolt. And so I took an interest in that. And so that's where I started, and to a certain extent I've been pursuing the same interests, but politics has changed in terms of the priorities that the world has thrown up, rather than I feel as though I've had so many dramatic changes myself.
And do you
And
think that informal like setting was sort of imperative for like that passion to be able to be developed, sort of with your parents in terms of like that informal setting and just being able to talk about it freely? Do you think that was sort of not necessarily like how do I say this in terms of that sort of like is a harness for you and also your passions about being able to talk freely? Do you think that sort of like led to that?
absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the things which we're in danger of losing, actually, which is the space in which you can informally think out loud. And the point about thinking out loud is you're allowed to say stupid things without being cancelled. I mean, you experiment intellectually, and I mean, I was like every teenager, in as much as everything my parents did, I argued. They said white, I said black. Typically argumentative in that kind of teenage and rather immature, rebellious way that one does. My father had been made, got sacked, but then he'd set up his own business, and he was a small businessman, to say the least. I mean, we're not talking a big business, but it was because he got sacked and he had to. So we've gone through this sort of terrible thing of him losing his job and the demoralization that happens when that happens. But then, you know, somebody set him up in business. He then took on an apprentice, and I immediately started lecturing him about exploiting the working class. Can you imagine how irritating that was for him? So that's what I mean about a certain naivety. You know, I was like, oh, you can't take on this. You're not paying him enough. You should be on it, you know, all this sort of stuff. But your question is really important because in some ways, having the freedom and the space to argue and, you know, think and ask questions and not have lots of arguments, but not be silenced is very important. And that was actually the atmosphere at university, which is why I'm so saddened by the kind of silencing that goes on and the self-censorship, because partly we talked rubbish for the 3 years that I was at university. We would sit up late into the night solving the problems of the world, arguing the toss on absolutely everything. But that's exactly how you cultivate an intellectual sense of inquiry. You know, that I would say things people who knew better than me or different to me would argue back, but they'd then recommend, why don't you go and read this book or look at this documentary? And then I'd think about it, and you didn't feel as though if you said the wrong thing, you'd be banished. You'd go back and say maybe something different. You were not, it wasn't that you weren't held to account, but you were aware of the fact you were all involved in an endeavor to understand and find the truth of a particular issue. You'd come at things from a different perspective. And although I largely hung out with people on the left, there was loads of people on the right as well. And it was quite a stimulating time. And that also included talking to lecturers about things and having a sense that we knew we were privileged to go to university. No one from my family had ever gone to university. It was a very small percentage went. I've gone to a comprehensive school and hadn't had a, you know, I was lucky to get to university, but it wasn't just that I was studying English literature. It gave me the freedom to explore and try out some outlandish ideas, precisely so that I could rein them in and consider. And at least when at least by the time I left university and went into my 20s, it gave me the basis on which I was able to really consider the world that I lived in and what I really thought about things.
But so you talk about the idea of no censorship, but would you not argue that there's almost a danger in exposing young people to some extreme views?
Well, I mean, as you know, I'm nervous about even what you mean by a danger of. And so the first thing to distinguish is that I'm talking about going to university, and I know that we've kind of got into a new infantilized moment where people who go to university are treated as though they're still at school. But that is meant to be the rite of passage in which you enter into adulthood. And the privilege of going to university, which, by the way, at that stage, not many people did, but a lot of people left school at 15, 16, and they were then in the world of adults, right? So now it's all post 18. But post 18, no, you have to be open to everything, right? And you will hear views which other people say are extreme, but how do you know whether they are dangerous or not? And what does a dangerous idea actually, who decides what's a dangerous idea? Now, we're all aware of the fact that, for example, at the moment, there's a big consternation about Andrew Tate, and he is very popular amongst school age boys, particularly. There aren't many girls who are kind of queuing up to listen to his drivel. But that's my opinion about his drivel. And the point is, every attempt at banning Andrew Tate, right, has meant he's become more popular. So the other thing you've got to consider is the problem people hearing those ideas, or is the problem the susceptibility of people wanting to hear those ideas? And what happens to those ideas if you try and ban them is that they develop a glamour that is particularly attractive to younger people, because immediately people think, oh, why are they trying to ban these ideas? And so if there's an issue with Andrew Tate, it might be why there is the popular appetite for, you know, anti-women sentiment amongst young men. That's worth asking a question on, rather than Andrew Tate is the devil incarnate, we must ban him. And I'd rather be having the arguments that I'd rather be watching the Andrew Tate video with people and saying what and taking it down, as it were, or and people would maybe disagree with me, but that would be more useful than me just simply tutting banning Andrew Tate, and then everyone's watching him anyway, some other way, right? And people will get round censorship. And even on more, well, not even on any topic, if you ban, you are in danger of simply pushing it underground. And in the era of new technology, that makes it even more you're unlikely to be able to physically ever stop things. And just a final thing on this, when I my partner spent some time in China, and when I went over there, immediately think China, it's all censorship. And we kind of went, and of course it was, I remember writing an article and I was like Googling, and I thought, why is nothing coming up? And I thought, oh yeah, I'm in China, I can't get access. Of course, the students at the university that I was staying with said, oh, all you have to do is to use this VPN and you can get onto this site, right? So like, even in authoritarian regimes where they've got state censorship explicit, people can and will access information and do.
Yeah, I think an interesting point about that is instead of like sort of the direct correlation between a certain person or anything, what's the underlying theme between that? And that's the discussion we should be having, instead of, just taking that, deplatforming that specific person. It's more about, what are they actually trying to talk about? And is this an issue that's worth discussing? And in most cases, I would say that it is. And then it's actually about discussing that issue on a broader sort of more level instead of that specific person. And I think that's sort of, Anirudh, I don't know about you, what you would say to that, but I think that's probably the issue we have, is that we focus so much on people and then trying to deplatform them because they're the most popular when it comes to spreading issues. But then we don't actually have a well-informed discussion and debate about the issue itself from all sides.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think what Baroness Fox talked about, the idea, rather than cancelling Andrew Tate, completely getting rid of him off a platform, rather if you debunk everything he says in a video, I think that would become probably more popular in many ways than just cancelling him, because when you cancel him, he becomes more popular, as we've seen. But also, you're educating people in a way in which everyone can share their own opinion on the matter, rather than getting rid of one viewpoint.
Yeah,
completely.
Now, I think with Andrew Tate, we might feel that we can all agree. We might not all agree, but not all your listeners might agree. But I can see that it's not going to be so difficult to debunk a lot of what he says. Oh, it's an attitude problem, and some people might say, "Well, yeah, I do think all women are property, and why shouldn't you?" And we'd have an argument about it. But there are other issues, and this is why I kind of queried the extremism point, which are more ambivalent. So, take the issue of the small boats and the refugee crossings at the moment is a good one, right? A lot of people would say that some of the antagonism to the arrival of small boats is just racism and is extreme and therefore shouldn't be discussed. And that's a viewpoint. Again, I mean, that's a perfectly valid viewpoint to have. And I'm constantly having arguments about that. And yet, if we don't understand why it is that so many people see the arrival of the small boats as being a real slap across the face to them, and worry about what it means to not control your borders and so on. And if you just write that off as racism and never discuss it, the problem is that it's actually a very complicated scenario. For me, it's certainly, I don't think it is racist to be concerned about small boats arriving, but there are racists who are going to exploit the arrival of the small boats and so on and so forth, right? So you've got these kind of discussions going on, but not talking about it is not going to tackle that issue at all. It's an actual real world issue. And I just before I came on about a woman who has been found guilty of malicious allegations in relation to the grooming gangs and the infamous grooming gangs in the Northwest. She actually accused people of rape and torture. It's now been proven that she actually self-inflicted those wounds on herself. She was somebody who Tommy Robinson's crowd used to explain about the grooming gang, right? So that's important to understand that, right? But there were grooming gangs, and there were victims, real proven victims of grooming gangs. And because people were frightened to raise issues in relation to grooming gangs in case they were accused of racism, they didn't. Young women were treated a bit. I mean, Andrew Tate might talk about it. This is people who was doing it, right? In plain sight, and nobody tackled it. And yet that young woman who's just been prosecuted is a malicious, nasty. I mean, if ever I was furious, because she's going to discredit the whole thing. The point about all of these issues is they're sometimes complicated, and you want to have the discussion, and it's perfectly reasonable to ask questions about, well, if you call them Asian grooming gangs, is that completely ridiculous because that's a racial, a collective racial label? Is it just Muslim grooming gangs? Is that then not fair, etc., etc.? But by not discussing it, hundreds of young women were exploited and treated abysmally, and B, you create the atmosphere of not being able to talk about something which is obviously a problem, but might well not be as simple as just saying the Asian grooming gangs. But if you're not discussing it, you can't even counter it. If you say that anyone who raises it must be a Tommy Robinson supporter, Tommy Robinson, for the record, is somebody I despise. But if anyone who talks about grooming gangs because he wants to talk about grooming gangs is then written off as a far-right Tommy Robinson type, then you allow social problems to develop, and a kind of conspiratorial mentality emerges where local people feel we're being stopped. And that actually exacerbates, we're being stopped discussing this, that exacerbates racial tensions, ironically. It makes it worse.
And I think also sort of using that sort of coining term of racism for like quite a few things. I remember when you came to our school and we talked about it when talking about cancel culture, and you mentioned this point where it sort of undermines the definition of racism as well. When we sort of use that term like with every case where there is a potential for it to be used. And if we don't actually think about it and discuss whether it's actually to do with racism, what it's to do with the point at hand, I think that's an important point as well. Whereas we have a lot of these terms: misogyny, racism, homophobia, xenophobia, whatever it may be. And sort of we need to actually understand what the definition is and where we need to use those terms. And there is and while we don't actually use those terms when they're not applied, you can still discuss the issue at hand. And I think that's something, especially in our generation, I'm happy to say that we need to learn that, because I think in our generation specifically, and sort of maybe the generation above us, I don't know, it's sort of, we are very happy to throw these terms around without actually understanding how they link to the issue.
And the point is how that links to cancel culture, which is what I said at the school, which was, the problem is that once then you give somebody this label, the assumption is then you don't have to engage with them.
Yeah.
Then there's somebody that you can just, so what they're saying is ignored. They as an individual have their reputations, besmirched, and they can be written off as, why would you talk to them? They are this, they are this. I did an interview this morning. I mean, I was just doing the paper review on Times Radio. It wasn't very exciting. And quite a lot of comments on social media was to Times Radio, well, why do you have that vile woman on? I mean, that's that. Some of them were nice, but largely it was hostile. And this dates that back a lot to Brexit, but I don't want to go into the specifics. The point was that what they were saying was that I shouldn't be allowed on a paper review. Somebody was saying what you said was very sinister. I was discussing the papers with Hugo Rifkin about whether we should have compulsory maths till 18. Actually, partly it was about the small boats issue, and partly it was about masking in, i.e. the paper review. People were saying I shouldn't be on, but they didn't say why. And it was like this sinister thing. And I'm not complaining for myself, by the way. I mean, that's the way it operates. The label then means that you are not invited on, or, I am, but that people can be dismissed. And I think from your generation's point of view, the difficulty is that it means that if you misspeak and gain one of these labels, that can have a very damaging impact on your career, on your future, on your social circles. So that's my fear, is that people self-censor because they don't want to say the wrong thing, or they go along in a conformist way with what they know won't upset anyone. And then they're not thinking.